Welcome back to the quiet corners of the past. As the noise of the modern world fades away, we find ourselves looking back at the steady, deliberate march of history. Tonight, our journey takes us into the heart of the ancient and medieval worlds to explore the greatest armies that ever crossed the earth. We so often think of history as a series of loud, chaotic moments, but beneath the surface there was a quiet, profound rhythm of order. There were minds that brought structure to the vastness of human ambition. Tonight, we will explore how thousands of individuals learned to move as a single unified force. How the simple, rhythmic beat of a drum or the silent raising of a banner could guide an empire forward across the plains. As your guide, I do not experience the heavy fatigue of a long march or the weight of a bronze shield, but I can gather these ancient stories and share their gentle, distant echoes with you. We will look at the invisible threads that held these massive forces together, the unwavering discipline of the phalanx, the silent coordination of the cavalry, and the deep bonds forged on the road. So, let your mind drift away from the worries of the day. Let the steady, distant heartbeat of history guide you into a peaceful, deep rest. Close your eyes, breathe in the quiet air of the past, and let us step into the story together. 1. The mystery of Homer. The true identity of Homer remains one of the greatest literary mysteries of all time, as there is no concrete historical evidence that a single blind bard by that name actually existed. Many scholars believe Homer might have been a collective name for generations of oral poets who contributed to the epic, or perhaps a single genius compiler who finally wove centuries of oral tradition into the cohesive masterpiece we know today. 2. An oral tradition. Long before it was ever written down, the Iliad was performed orally by bards called rhapsodes, who memorized the massive poem and recited it at Greek festivals and gatherings. These performers relied on a strict meter and repetitive stock phrases, such as swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered dawn, to help them remember the lines and maintain the rhythmic flow of the epic during hours-long performances. Dactylic hexameter. The epic is composed in a specific poetic meter called dactylic hexameter, which consists of 6 beats per line and gives the poem a sweeping musical cadence in its original ancient Greek. This complex metrical structure was not just for aesthetic beauty. It acted as a mnemonic device that allowed ancient singers to improvise within the rigid rules of the verse when performing live for audiences. Not the whole war, despite being the most famous account of the Trojan War. The Iliad does not cover the entire 10-year conflict. In fact, it only covers a span of about 51 days during the final year of the war. The epic entirely skips the famous events of the war's beginning, such as the judgment of Paris and the gathering of the Greek fleet, and focuses exclusively on the fallout from a bitter dispute between Achilles and Agamemnon. 5. The missing Trojan horse. One of the most widespread misconceptions about the Iliad is that it features the story of the Trojan horse, but this iconic wooden stratagem is nowhere to be found in the text. The actual fall of Troy and the story of the horse are only briefly referenced in Homer's sequel, the Odyssey, and are later detailed much more thoroughly in Virgil's Roman epic, the Aeneid. The written standardization. The oral poem was likely first committed to writing during the 8th or 7th century BCE, utilizing the newly adopted Greek alphabet, which was adapted from the Phoenicians. Later, in the 6th century BCE, the Athenian tyrant Pisistratos supposedly commissioned a standardized written text of the poem to be recited at the Panathenaic Games, ensuring that the version we have today didn't fracture into countless regional variations. 24 books, the epic is divided into 24 distinct books or scrolls, a division that was not created by Homer himself, but rather by later Hellenistic scholars working at the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. These scholars divided the text based on the 24 letters of the Greek alphabet, aiming to create manageable scroll lengths for reading and archiving, rather than following natural narrative breaks. The epic cycle. The Iliad is actually just one surviving piece of a much larger collection of ancient epics known as the epic cycle, which originally detailed the entire history of the Trojan War from start to finish. Unfortunately, the other poems in this cycle, such as the Cypria, the war's origins, and the Persis, the sack of Troy, have been lost to history, surviving only in scattered fragments and brief summaries by later writers. 9. The Mycenaean setting. The story is set during the Bronze Age, specifically the Mycenaean period of Greece, which occurred roughly around the 12th century BCE, centuries before Homer's own time. While Homer includes many accurate details about Bronze Age warfare and geography, he also anachronistically includes elements from his own Iron Age era, such as the use of iron tools and specific religious practices. The first word is rage. The very first word of the original Greek text is menin, which translates to rage or wrath, immediately establishing the central theme of the entire poem. This isn't just ordinary human anger. Menin is a word usually reserved for the devastating, world-altering wrath of the gods, highlighting the catastrophic scale of Achilles' emotional breakdown. 11. Achilles' fatal flaw. Achilles is the greatest warrior among the Greeks, but his defining characteristic in the epic is his overwhelming, stubborn pride rather than just his physical invulnerability. Unlike later myths that claim he was dipped in the river Styx and vulnerable only in his heel, Homer's Iliad presents Achilles as fully mortal and capable of being wounded anywhere, relying solely on his extraordinary skill and divine armor. Agamemnon's arrogance. King Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief of the Greek forces, is depicted as a deeply flawed leader who prioritizes his own status and authority over the well-being of his army. His refusal to return a captured priestess, Chryseis, to her father brings a devastating plague upon the Greek camp, setting off the entire chain of events that forms the plot of the Epic 13. The conflict over Briseis. The central dispute of the epic begins when Agamemnon is forced to return Chryseis and compensates himself by confiscating Briseis, a captive woman who had been awarded to Achilles as a war prize. Achilles views this as a profound insult to his honor time and responds by withdrawing himself and his Myrmidon warriors from the fighting, uncaring that the Greeks will be slaughtered without him. 14. Odysseus the diplomat. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca and future star of the Odyssey, plays a crucial role in the Iliad as the cleverest of the Greeks and their primary diplomat. He is the one chosen to lead an embassy to Achilles in Book 9, using his masterful rhetoric and psychological manipulation to try and convince the furious warrior to return to the battlefield. 15. Diomedes' god-fighting Aristeia. In Book 5, the Greek hero Diomedes experiences a state of battlefield supremacy known as an Aristeia, where he goes on an unstoppable killing spree. Empowered by the goddess Athena, Diomedes becomes so terrifyingly effective that he actually manages to physically wound two Olympian gods, Aphrodite and Ares, driving them off the battlefield in pain. Great Ajax the Bulwark, Telamonian Ajax, often called Great Ajax, is the second most valuable Greek warrior after Achilles, renowned for his massive size and his colossal shield made of 7 layers of ox hide and bronze. Unlike many other heroes, Ajax never receives direct help from the gods in the epic. He relies entirely on his own brute strength and unyielding courage to hold the line against the Trojans. Little Ajax and the Oilean Hubris, the other Ajax, known as Lesser Ajax or Oilean Ajax, is a swift runner and skilled spearman who fights alongside Great Ajax, forming a dynamic duo. However, he is notorious for his arrogant and boastful nature, a trait that ultimately leads to his downfall in later myths when he angers the gods during the sack of Troy. Nestor's long-winded advice. Nestor, the elderly king of Pylos, serves as the wise elder statesman of the Greek army, often stepping in to mediate disputes between the hot-headed younger commanders. Homer characterizes him with a touch of humor by making him incredibly long-winded, as Nestor frequently prefaces his advice with lengthy, nostalgic stories about how much tougher and braver warriors were back in his youth. 19. Patroclus, the beloved companion. Patroclus is Achilles' closest companion and dearest friend, whose gentle nature contrasts sharply with Achilles' ruthless intensity. His deep empathy for the dying Greek soldiers eventually drives him to borrow Achilles' armor and enter the battle, a fateful decision that seals his doom and radically alters the course of the war. 20. Menelaus, the wronged husband. Menelaus is the king of Sparta and the younger brother of Agamemnon, whose wife Helen was taken by Paris, sparking the entire war. Though not the absolute greatest fighter, he is fiercely dedicated and fights bravely, notably defeating Paris in a single combat duel that would have ended the war if the gods hadn't intervened. 21. Hector, the true hero of Troy. Hector, the crown prince of Troy and their greatest warrior, is arguably the most sympathetic and humanized character in the entire epic. Unlike Achilles, who fights for personal glory and revenge, Hector fights out of a deep sense of duty to his city, his aging parents, and his wife and child, knowing full well that he is likely doomed. 22. Paris, the reluctant prince. Paris is depicted as a stark contrast to his brother Hector. He is handsome, skilled with a bow, and favored by Aphrodite, but often cowardly and more interested in his bedchamber than the battlefield. His reckless abduction of Helen brought destruction to his people, and his frequent reluctance to fight earns him the intense scorn of both Hector and Helen herself. 23. Priam's tragic kingship. King Priam is the elderly ruler of Troy, a man who has lived to see his mighty empire besieged and many of his 50 sons killed in combat. His journey in the final book of the epic, sneaking into the enemy camp to beg the man who murdered his son for the body back, is one of the most poignant and emotionally devastating scenes in Western literature. 24. Aeneas, the survivor. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and son of the goddess Aphrodite, fights valiantly in the Iliad but is explicitly protected by the gods because he is fated to survive the war. The gods intervene multiple times to save him from certain death at the hands of Diomedes and Achilles, preserving him so that he can lead the Trojan survivors and eventually found the lineage of Rome. Glaucus and the golden armor. Glaucus is a brave Lycian ally of the Trojans who has a famous encounter with the Greek hero Diomedes in the middle of a chaotic battle. When they realized their grandfathers were guest friends, Xenia, they refuse to fight each other and agree to trade armor instead. However, Homer notes that Zeus stole Glaucus's wits as he traded his priceless gold armor for Diomedes' cheap bronze gear. 26. Sarpedon's noble death. Sarpedon, another Lycian leader and a mortal son of Zeus, gives one of the most famous speeches in the epic, explaining that kings must fight on the front lines to earn the taxes and respect of their people, the concept of noblesse oblige. His death at the hands of Patroclus causes Zeus immense grief, prompting the king of the gods to rain blood from the sky and send gods to carry Sarpedon's body home. 27. Polydamas the cautious. Polydamas is a Trojan commander and seer who frequently acts as the voice of reason and caution, acting as a foil to Hector's aggressive battlefield tactics. He repeatedly advises Hector to pull the Trojan army back behind the city walls when Achilles returns to the battle, but Hector ignores this wise counsel, leading to a massive slaughter of the Trojan forces. 8. Helen's guilt and regret. Helen of Sparta, now in Troy, is heavily featured, weaving a tapestry that depicts the suffering of the war she caused, showing acute self-awareness of her tragic role. She despises Paris for his cowardice and expresses deep regret for leaving her homeland, often wishing she had died before bringing such misery to both the Greeks and the Trojans. Andromache's heartbreak. Andromache, the wife of Hector, provides the emotional core of the Trojan perspective, fully aware that if Hector falls, she will be enslaved and their infant son murdered. Her farewell scene with Hector on the walls of Troy, where their baby is initially terrified by Hector's crested helmet, is a masterpiece of portraying the deeply personal, domestic cost of warfare. 30. The prophetic Cassandra. Though she plays a larger role in later myths, Cassandra, a daughter of Priam, makes brief appearances in the Iliad. She is cursed by Apollo with the gift of true prophecy, but the tragedy that no one will ever believe her, forcing her to watch helplessly as her family marches toward the doom she has foreseen. 31. The divine audience. The gods in the Iliad function almost like spectators at a sporting event, constantly watching the mortal battles from Mount Olympus or the peaks of Mount Ida. They have favorite mortals, harbor deep grudges, and frequently alter the course of the fighting to settle petty disputes among themselves, treating the brutal human war as a high-stakes game. 32. Athena's Greek bias. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, is fiercely loyal to the Greeks and deeply hates the Trojans because Paris did not choose her in the beauty contest that started the war. She constantly intervenes to protect Greek heroes like Diomedes, Odysseus, and Achilles, and ruthlessly tricks Hector into stopping his flight so Achilles can kill him. 33. Apollo the archer and defender. Apollo is the primary divine protector of the Trojans, a terrifying deity who unleashes a plague of arrows on the Greeks in Book 1 because Agamemnon insulted his priest. He actively participates in the battles, most notably when he strikes Patroclus from behind, knocking off his armor and leaving him defenseless against Hector's fatal blow. 34. Aphrodite's clumsy warfare. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is deeply invested in saving Paris and the Trojans, but she is completely unsuited for the brutal reality of the battlefield. When she tries to rescue her son Aeneas from combat, she is stabbed in the wrist by Diomedes, dropping Aeneas in pain and fleeing to Olympus, where Zeus gently tells her to stick to matters of love. 35. Hera's hatred of Troy. Hera, the queen of the gods, shares Athena's vicious hatred for Troy due to the judgment of Paris, and she will stop at nothing to see the city burned to ash. She frequently schemes behind her husband Zeus's back, at one point seducing him and putting him to sleep so that Poseidon can illegally help the Greeks while Zeus is distracted. 36. Zeus and the Golden Scales. As the supreme ruler of the gods, Zeus attempts to maintain a semblance of neutrality and enforce the decrees of fate. Though he occasionally favors individuals like Hector and Achilles, in critical moments he utilizes a set of golden scales to weigh the fates of opposing warriors. When Hector's side of the scale sinks toward the underworld, Zeus knows he must let the Trojan prince die. 37. The Deception of Zeus in Book 14. Hera enacts a masterclass in divine deception by borrowing Aphrodite's enchanted breastband of desire and enlisting the god of sleep to knock out her husband. This hilarious and beautifully poetic sequence, known as the Dios Aparte, allows the Greeks to push the Trojans back from their ships, while the king of the gods is happily distracted and snoring. 38. The Theomarchy, Gods at War. In Book 21, the gods finally stop fighting through human proxies and engage in direct, chaotic combat with one another in a sequence known as the Theomachy. This clash is both awe-inspiring and slightly comedic, as Athena beats Ares with a boulder, Hera boxes Artemis's ears with her own bow, and Poseidon mocks Apollo 39. Hephaestus and the river god, when Achilles goes on a murderous rampage and clogs the river Scamander with Trojan corpses, the angry river god rises up and nearly drowns the great hero. Achilles is only saved when the fire god Hephaestus intervenes at Hera's command, boiling the river with divine fire until the water god begs for mercy and retreats. Ares the whiner, despite being the god of war, Ares is depicted quite poorly in the Iliad, coming across as a bloodthirsty but cowardly brute who aligns with the Trojans. When he is wounded by a mortal, Diomedes, with Athena's help, he flees to Olympus and dramatically complains to Zeus, only for Zeus to bluntly tell him that he is the most detestable god on the mountain. 41. The duel of Menelaus and Paris. Early in the epic, the two armies agree to halt the slaughter and settle the war through a one-on-one duel between the two men who started it all. Menelaus easily beats Paris and is dragging him by his helmet strap to kill him, but Aphrodite magically breaks the strap and teleports Paris away to his bedroom, invalidating the truce. 42. The breaking of the truce. After Paris is whisked away, the gods debate the outcome, and Athena takes it upon herself to ensure the war continues and Troy is destroyed. She disguises herself and convinces a foolish Trojan archer named Pandarus to shoot an arrow at Menelaus, wounding him slightly, breaking the sacred oath of truce, and plunging the armies back into total war. 43. The embassy to Achilles. In Book 9, the Greeks are facing utter defeat, so Agamemnon finally caves and sends Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix to offer Achilles massive wealth and the return of Briseis if he will fight. In a stunning subversion of expected heroic behavior, Achilles rejects the staggering riches, questioning the very nature of heroic glory and declaring that no amount of loot is worth his life. 44. The Dolonaea, the night raid. Book 10 takes a dark, covert turn when Odysseus and Diomedes sneak into the Trojan camp at night to gather intelligence. They capture a Trojan spy named Dolon, interrogate him for information, ruthlessly execute him despite his pleas for mercy, and then massacre a camp of sleeping Thracian allies to steal their legendary horses. 45. The breach of the Greek wall. As Achilles continues his strike, Hector leads a ferocious assault on the defensive wall and trench the Greeks have built around their ships. In a moment of supreme triumph, Hector picks up a massive boulder that no normal men could lift, smashes the wooden gates to splinters, and leads the Trojans pouring into the Greek camp. 46. Fire at the ships. The absolute lowest point for the Greek forces comes when Hector finally reaches the very ships of the Achaeans and manages to set one on fire. This is the critical turning point of the entire epic, as the sight of the burning ship finally convinces Achilles to allow his friend Patroclus to borrow his armor and push the Trojans back. 47. The glory of Patroclus wearing Achilles' armor. Patroclus successfully terrifies the Trojans and drives them away from the ships, experiencing an incredible killing spree of his own. However, he becomes drunk on his own success and disobeys Achilles' strict order to return immediately after saving the ships, instead charging all the way to the walls of Troy. 48. The death of Patroclus. Patroclus' rampage is brought to a brutal end by a combination of divine and mortal intervention. Apollo strikes him from behind and knocks off his helmet. A minor Trojan spears him in the back, and Hector delivers the final killing blow. As he dies, Patroclus uses his last breath to prophesy Hector's imminent death at the hands of Achilles. 49. The fight for the body. A desperate, multi-book battle erupts over the corpse of Patroclus, as both sides recognize the massive strategic and psychological value of claiming the body and the armor. The Greeks, led by Menelaus and Ajax, eventually managed to drag the naked, mutilated body back to their camp, but Hector successfully strips and claims Achilles' divine armor as his prize 50. Achilles is in human grief. When Achilles receives the news of Patroclus' death, his grief is so incredibly violent and physical that he collapses, tearing his hair out and pouring ashes over his face. His sorrow quickly calcifies into a terrifying sociopathic rage, completely transforming his character from a sulking man into a supernatural force of death, fixated solely on vengeance. 51. The shield of Achilles, after Hector steals his original armor. Achilles' mother, Thetis, asks the forge god Hephaestus to make her son a new set. Hephaestus crafts an astonishing, magical shield decorated with incredibly intricate concentric circles depicting the cosmos, a city at peace, a city at war, farming and dancing, a masterpiece of literary description known as ekphrasis. 52. The symbolism of the shield. The shield of Achilles is not just cool armor. It is a profound, symbolic representation of the entire human experience and the wider world outside of the Trojan War. By carrying this shield into combat, Achilles is literally bringing the totality of human life, peace, and civilization into the destructive, chaotic sphere of total war. 53. Hector doomed by armor. When Hector strips Patroclus and puts on Achilles' old armor, it acts as a visual symbol of his impending doom. By wearing the armor of the man who will kill him, Hector is symbolically marked for death, and Achilles knows exactly where the weak points in his old armor are when they finally duel. 54. The boar's tusk helmet. Homer describes Odysseus wearing a very specific leather helmet, reinforced with rows of gleaming white boar tusks during the night raid in Book 10. For centuries, scholars thought this was purely mythological, until archaeologists actually excavated Mycenaean tombs and found the exact boar's tusk helmets Homer described, proving a link to genuine Bronze Age artifacts. 55. Ash spears. The primary weapon of the heroes in the Iliad is not the sword, but the heavy throwing and thrusting spear made of tough ash wood and tipped with bronze. Achilles' own spear, the Pelian ash spear given to his father by the centaur Chiron, is so massive and heavy that he is the only Greek warrior physically capable of wielding it. 56. Chariot warfare. Heroes in the epic frequently arrive at the battlefield riding in horse-drawn chariots driven by dedicated charioteers. However, unlike the Egyptians or Hittites who used chariots as mobile archery platforms, Homeric heroes use them more like ancient battle taxis, dismounting to fight on foot and using the chariot to retreat or chase down fleeing enemies. Spoils of war. Armor was incredibly expensive and difficult to forge in the Bronze Age, making it the most highly prized loot on the battlefield. When a hero kills an enemy in the Iliad, their immediate instinct is not to keep fighting, but to stand over the corpse and meticulously strip the bronze armor off the body to take home as a trophy of their Kleos, glory. 58. Agamemnon's corselet. Homer dedicates significant time to describing Agamemnon's spectacular armor before he enters battle, detailing a corselet gifted by the king of Cyprus, made of dark enamel, gold, and tin, featuring decorative serpents. This incredible wealth highlights Agamemnon's immense political power and resources, even if he isn't the absolute best fighter in the army. 59. The yoke of the horses. Achilles' chariot is pulled by two immortal, talking horses named Xanthus and Balius, who were a wedding gift from the gods to his father. After Patroclus dies, these divine horses actually weep on the battlefield, and Hera briefly gives Xanthus the power of human speech so he can prophesy Achilles' own impending death. 60. bronze versus iron. Throughout the text, the weapons and armor are described as being made of bronze, accurately reflecting the metallurgy of the Mycenaean era. However, Homer occasionally slips and mentions iron tools, like iron axes given as prizes in funeral games, which betrays the fact that the poet was living in the later Iron Age and weaving contemporary details into the ancient story. 61. The Anatomy of Death. Homer takes a surprisingly gruesome and medically precise approach to describing the deaths of soldiers in the Iliad. The epic is filled with highly specific, anatomically accurate descriptions of spears shattering collarbones, severing spinal cords, and piercing bladders, showing a deep cultural familiarity with the reality of traumatic battle wounds. The concept of psyche in the Homeric worldview, when a warrior dies, his psyche, often translated as breath or soul, leaves his limbs and flies down to the underworld. However, this is not a glorious afterlife. The soul becomes a gibbering, mindless shade, highlighting the tragic reality that all human vitality and strength are permanently lost upon death. 63. The importance of burial, a central anxiety for every warrior in the Iliad, is the fear of their body being left unburied to be eaten by dogs and scavenging birds. Without proper funeral rites and burning on a pyre, the soul of the deceased cannot cross the river Styx and find peace in Hades, condemning them to wander aimlessly between realms. 64. Achilles' brutal sacrifices. During the lavish funeral rites for Patroclus, Achilles' grief drives him to commit acts of extreme barbarity that shock even the ancient audience. He slaughters dogs, horses, and 12 captured Trojan youths on Patroclus' funeral pyre, an act of human sacrifice that the poet explicitly condemns as a wicked and brutal deed. 65. The funeral games. After cremating Patroclus, Achilles hosts elaborate athletic competitions in his honor, featuring chariot racing, boxing, wrestling, and foot races. These games serve a vital psychological function in the epic, allowing the fractured Greek commanders to reconcile, channel their aggression into non-lethal competition, and begin restoring the social order of the army. 66. Hector's desecration. When Achilles finally kills Hector, he commits the ultimate sacrilege by piercing the tendons in Hector's heels, tying him to the back of his chariot, and dragging the corpse in the dirt around the walls of Troy. He continues to drag the body around Patroclus' tomb for days, attempting to mutilate it out of sheer spite, though the gods secretly protect the flesh from decaying. 67. The ghost of Patroclus. While Achilles is sleeping, the restless ghost of Patroclus appears to him, begging him to hold the funeral quickly so he can enter the underworld. The ghost also asks that their ashes eventually be buried together in the same urn so they can remain united in death, a heartbreaking request that Achilles honors. The ransom of Hector, the climax of the entire epic, is not a massive battle, but a quiet, deeply tense scene in Achilles' tent where King Priam secretly arrives to ransom his son's body. Priam kisses the hands of the man who murdered his children, a gesture of supreme humility that completely breaks Achilles' hardened heart and restores his lost humanity. 69. Shared grief. As Priam and Achilles weep together, Priam for his lost son Hector, and Achilles for his own father and his dead friend Patroclus, they recognize the universal tragedy of human suffering. This profound moment of empathy between bitter enemies stands as one of the most powerful anti-war messages in all of classical literature. 70. The final line. The Iliad does not end with the fall of Troy or the death of Achilles. It ends simply with the burial of the Trojan prince. The final line of the epic is stark and understated. And so they buried Hector, breaker of horses, bringing the poem full circle from the devastating rage of Achilles to a moment of quiet, mournful resolution. 71. Kleos, immortal glory. The driving motivation for the heroes in the Iliad is Kleos, concept of winning immortal glory and fame through incredible feats of bravery in battle. Because the Greek afterlife was a bleak, joyless existence, the only way to achieve true immortality was to have your name and deeds sung by poets for all eternity. Time, honor, and status, closely related to kleos, is time, which is the physical manifestation of a warrior's honor in the form of war prizes, loot, and public respect. When Agamemnon takes Briseis from Achilles, he isn't just taking a captive woman, he is publicly stripping Achilles of his time, which is a catastrophic blow to his social standing and identity. Nostos? Homecoming? Nostos is the theme of homecoming, which heavily drives the Odyssey but also plays a critical role in the Iliad. Achilles is famously given a choice by his mother. He can either have a long, peaceful life with a successful Nostos but be forgotten, or he can stay in Troy, die young, and achieve eternal kleos. 74. The illusion of free will. The characters in the Iliad are constantly caught between their own agency and the inescapable decrees of fate, Moira. Even Zeus cannot easily overturn fate. When his own mortal son Sarpedon is destined to die, Zeus considers saving him but is warned by Hera that doing so would unravel the very fabric of the universe. Xenia, guest friendship. The ancient Greek concept of xenia, or sacred hospitality, is a recurring theme that dictates the rules of civilization, even amidst brutal warfare. The entire Trojan War is fundamentally a punishment for a massive violation of xenia, as Paris abused Menelaus's hospitality by running off with his host's wife and treasure. 76. The role of women. While the Iliad is a hyper-masculine war epic, women like Helen, Andromache, and Hecuba act as the moral compass of the poem, articulating the tragic costs of male vanity and violence. They are the ones who truly understand the consequences of the war, as they are the ones who will suffer slavery and rape when the men are dead. The similes of nature. To balance the endless descriptions of bronze and blood, Homer uses incredibly vivid, extended similes comparing the warriors to natural phenomena like flooded rivers, predatory lions, swarms of bees, or falling trees. These similes ground the mythological warfare in the everyday experiences of the ancient audience, connecting the brutal carnage to the rhythms of the natural world. Supplication, the physical act of supplication, falling to one's knees and grasping the knees or chin of a superior to beg for mercy, is a sacred ritual in the epic. Achilles' total loss of humanity is most clearly demonstrated when he heartlessly rejects the supplication of the Trojan prince Lycaon, butchering him in the river despite his desperate pleas. 79. The gods as comic relief. In stark contrast to the grim, fatalistic lives of the mortals, the scenes featuring the Olympian gods are often light-hearted, petty, and comedic. Because the gods cannot die and face no real consequences, their squabbles serve to highlight the tragic dignity of the mortals, who must fight and die for what they believe in. 80. A foundational text. The Iliad was not just a popular story, it served as the foundational text for ancient Greek culture, religion, and education. It was treated somewhat like a secular Bible, used to teach young Greeks how to read, how to speak eloquently, how to fight, and what moral values to uphold in their daily lives. 81. Alexander the Great's obsession. Alexander the Great was famously obsessed with the Iliad and viewed himself as a direct descendant and reincarnation of Achilles. He reportedly slept with a copy of the epic, annotated by his tutor, Aristotle, and a dagger under his pillow, and made a special pilgrimage to Troy to lay a wreath on Achilles' tomb before invading Persia. 82. The ruins of Troy. For centuries, modern historians believed Troy was entirely fictional, until a wealthy, eccentric German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann used the Iliad as a map in the 1870s and actually discovered the ruins of Troy, in modern-day Turkey, Hisarlik. However, Schliemann used dynamite to excavate, recklessly blowing up the very Bronze Age layer he was looking for in his rush to find gold. 83. 9 layers of Troy. Archaeologists have since discovered that the site of Troy was rebuilt multiple times over millennia, resulting in at least 9 distinct archaeological layers. The Troy of Homer's epic is generally believed by modern scholars to correspond with layer Troy VI, or Troy 7a, which show clear evidence of massive defensive walls and destruction by fire and warfare around 1180 BCE 84. The Hittite connection, modern decipherment of ancient Hittite diplomatic tablets, has revealed mentions of a city called Wilusa, which matches the Greek Ilios, the root of Iliad, and an Achaean Greek kingdom called Ahiawa. These tablets even mention a troublesome leader named Alexandru, Alexander Paris, providing tantalizing historical evidence that a real conflict inspired the myth. 85. The missing Achilles heel. The famous concept of the Achilles heel is nowhere in Homer's Iliad. It was added by a much later Roman poet named Statius in the 1st century CE in his unfinished epic, the Achilleid. In Homer's original text, Achilles is just an incredibly gifted, fully mortal man who happens to wear impenetrable armor forged by a god. 86. Helen's true power. In the Iliad, Helen is not just a passive victim or a helpless prize. She is an incredibly sharp-witted woman who possesses a magical drug called Nepenthe, which she uses later in the Odyssey to wipe away traumatic memories. She is highly critical of the men around her, and is the only mortal in the epic who dares to directly tell the goddess Aphrodite to shut up and leave her alone. The Catalogue of Ships, Book 2, contains a massive, incredibly detailed section known as the Catalogue of Ships, which lists every single Greek contingent, their commanders, their home cities, and how many ships they brought. While modern readers often find this list tedious, ancient audiences loved it because it acted as a geographical map and allowed different city-states to claim they participated in the legendary war. No villains. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Iliad is its overwhelming sense of objectivity. There are no cartoonish villains or purely righteous heroes. Even though the poet was Greek and singing for a Greek audience, the Trojan enemies are portrayed with immense dignity, courage, and humanity, making the epic a profound meditation on the shared suffering of war. The fate of Briseis, the woman whose capture sparks the entire plot, actually speaks in the epic when she is finally returned to Achilles, offering a heartbreaking lament over the body of Patroclus. She reveals that Patroclus was the only one who treated her with kindness in captivity and had promised to make Achilles marry her properly, highlighting the complex emotional trauma of women taken as war prizes. 90. Thersites the commoner. Out of the thousands of men in the epic, only one common soldier, an ugly, bandy-legged man named Thersites, dares to speak out against the kings in assembly, accurately pointing out Agamemnon's greed. Instead of being celebrated for speaking truth to power, he is brutally beaten with a scepter by Odysseus, while the rest of the army laughs, reinforcing the rigid, aristocratic hierarchy of the heroic age. 91. The translation challenge. Translating the Iliad is famously difficult because Homeric Greek contains words and grammatical structures that do not exist in modern languages. Translators constantly debate whether to make the text sound archaic and elevated, like Richmond Lattimore's literal version, or modern and emotionally accessible, like Emily Wilson's or Robert Fagels's contemporary versions. Renaissance rediscovery. During the Middle Ages, Western Europe essentially lost access to the Iliad in its original Greek, relying on highly distorted, romanticized Latin summaries where Trojans were usually the good guys, since Rome claimed Trojan descent. It wasn't until Greek scholars fled to Italy after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 that the complete Greek text was reintroduced to the West, fueling the Renaissance. The Aeneid connection: the Roman poet Virgil wrote the Aeneid explicitly as a sequel and response to Homer's epics, adopting the dactylic hexameter and structural elements of the Iliad. Virgil essentially flips the script, having the Trojan survivor Aeneas undergo an odyssey to reach Italy, and then fight an Iliad-style war in the second half of the poem to establish the foundation of Rome. The concept of Aristeia, the narrative structure of an Aristeia, a hero's moment of unstoppable, godlike supremacy on the battlefield, established the blueprint for modern action movies and superhero tropes. Whenever a modern action hero powers up to flawlessly take down a room full of enemies, they are participating in a narrative tradition pioneered by Diomedes and Achilles. 95. Pop culture influence. The epic has inspired countless adaptations, most notably the 2004 blockbuster film Troy, starring Brad Pitt, which ironically stripped out all the gods and condensed a 10-year war into a couple of weeks. More recently, Madeline Miller's smash hit novel The Song of Achilles retold the epic from the perspective of Patroclus, focusing heavily on his romantic relationship with Achilles. A tale of two fates, the epic frequently contrasts two distinct ways of facing death: the beautiful death, kalos thanatos, of a young warrior cut down in his prime, preserving his youthful glory forever, versus the pathetic death of an old man whose white hair and beard are defiled in the dust. Achilles actively chooses the former, solidifying his eternal youth in the cultural memory. The value of armor. To highlight the incredible wealth of the heroes, Homer sometimes prices their armor in terms of livestock, which was the standard currency before coined money. When Glaucus trades his gold armor for Diomedes' bronze, the text specifically notes that he traded armor worth 100 oxen for armor worth only 9. 98. The weeping horses. The intense emotional resonance of the epic extends even to the animals. Achilles' immortal horses are so paralyzed by grief over the death of Patroclus that they stand completely frozen on the battlefield, crying hot tears into the dust. Zeus himself looks down on them in pity, lamenting that he ever gave immortal creatures to wretched, doomed mortal men. 99. The god of sleep, the deity Hypnos, Sleep, makes a pivotal appearance when Hera bribes him to put Zeus to sleep, offering him a golden throne and the hand of a minor grace in marriage. Hypnos is terrified of Zeus, noting that the last time he tricked the king of the gods, Zeus threw him out of heaven, and he only barely survived by hiding with the goddess night. 100. A timeless anti-war epic, ultimately. While the Iliad glorifies heroic combat, its enduring power lies in its profound understanding of the total devastation that war brings to human civilization. By concluding the epic not with a triumphant victory, but with the sorrowful funeral of a defending father and husband, Homer cemented the Iliad as a timeless, deeply empathetic tragedy about the universal cost of rage. From the clash of bronze on the plains of Troy to the scheming of the gods on Mount Olympus, these 100 facts highlight the incredible depth and complexity of the Iliad. It is a story where divine intervention meets raw, human emotion, driven by the world-altering wrath of one man and culminating in the shared, quiet grief of two bitter enemies. By exploring the epic's historical roots, its oral traditions, and the tragic fates of characters like Hector and Patroclus, we get a much clearer picture of how generations of ancient bards wove this masterpiece together. The text is not just a straightforward chronicle of battles, it is a meticulously structured tragedy that balances the pursuit of immortal glory, kleos, with the devastating reality of mortality. Ultimately, The Iliad doesn't end with a triumphant victory, the Trojan horse, or the burning of the city. Instead, it leaves us with a quiet, sorrowful funeral, a powerful, concluding reminder of the epic's true focus on honor, grief, and the heavy price of rage.